Well, the reviews are in on the gay Spock video.
No, 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 no.
No, he wasn't. He was a very great actor.
No, he wasn't. No, he wasn't. No, he wasn't. No, he
Stop
wasn't.
taking
No,
our
he
characters
wasn't.
and
No.
create your own gay character. Make your own show and do whatever you want. Leave ours alone.
Oh, behave. Gay Vulcan is illogical.
I have seen every episode and all the movies, not that it matters, but I saw nothing to make me think Spock was gay.
I guess you don't know much about the original Star Trek. Just a bunch of woke people making up stories.
I disagree.
Fuck this group of fucking woke assholes.
Well, wasn't she pleasant to know? Not. Left of her own free will before I could throw her out.
Wow, you condensed what I felt about Spock into half an hour. I love your videos and am excited to see more from you, and would be excited if you chose to focus more on the topic of queerness in Star Trek.
Great video. You tied the whole thing into a broader societal message in a way I hadn't thought about before.
I am 13, recently came out. I am trans and gay. Do I even need to elaborate on why I have a newfound obsession for this guy?
This was a great video. I'd absolutely love to see one about TMP as well.
It made the homophobes mad and the gays happy, so let's talk more about how Kirk and Spock are gay. When Star Trek moved from the small screen to the big screen in 1979, the crew of the USS Enterprise was introduced into a new mode of storytelling. With more space, both in terms of the widescreen frame and the roughly doubled runtime, these adventures were bound to be different from the weekly 50-minute TV episodes. There are still plenty of similarities between the two, with several movies working off of ideas used in the show, but feature films also allowed for more dramatic story arcs, and frankly more character development. On TV, brief flashes of character were only visible when convenient for that week's plot. Rarely does an episode start with a character in one place and resolve with them in another. But the longer format of a feature film practically necessitates character arcs, and so we see our heroes grow and change over those 2 hours, and in some cases, films can more clearly illustrate the bonds between characters than any single episode might hope to do. This, of course, includes the most central bond in all of the original series: the relationship between Kirk and Spock. The relationship between Kirk and Spock is a core element of Star Trek, even if we ignore the homoeroticism. Just for a little bit. These two characters are the focal point of the show, with Leonard McCoy acting as a foil to both of them in different respects. The show poses Kirk as the protagonist, what with him being the captain and all, but Spock turned out to be a bit more interesting for the writers and viewers, to the point that TOS is often considered to be secretly about Spock. This means that Kirk and Spock take up much of the show's screen time, and one or both of them serve as the central agent in nearly every episode. The two are functionally inseparable, as captain and first officer, and the portrayal of deep bonds like this between men, known by some as the holy matrimony of males, is practically as old as storytelling itself. In the greater Western literary canon, there's a common enough phenomenon that I like to think of as you were so misogynistic that it became homoerotic. I suspect you've seen it before, where a male protagonist spurns women because he's too busy with the plot or something, and women only tie you down or are just plain annoying or whatever. Hell, maybe they're just kinda not around. But no man is an island, and this protagonist also has a right-hand man, a dear friend that is with him through trials and tribulations, and listen, that's gonna get at least a little homoerotic. If you put bros far enough before hoes, do the hoes even matter? Great American literature has its own brand of this trope, which dates back at least so far as Moby Dick, and has perhaps lingered in the popular consciousness longest through The Lone Ranger. In the American mythos, the white male hero faces the unknown of the unsettled frontier or some other boundless natural realm, eschewing society as he might know it. including marriage and long-term relationships with women, to ruggedly live in, or more likely to tame, quote-unquote, the wilderness, like manly, independent, quintessentially American men do. However, our strapping hero cannot actually do it alone, and has as his guide and partner some quote-unquote savage other by the standards of the presumed white colonialist audience. This trope is most often seen as a duo of frontiersman or cowboy and Native American, but not exclusively. Leslie Fiedler, in the book Love and Death in the American Novel, describes it as, quote, an archetypal relationship which also haunts the American psyche. Two lonely men, one dark-skinned, one white, bend together over a carefully guarded fire in the virgin heart of the American wilderness. They have forsaken all others for the sake of the austere, almost inarticulate but unquestioned love which binds them to each other and to the world of nature which they have preferred to civilization. This archetype of two men in isolation, as Fiedler indicates, easily lends itself to homoeroticism. I mean, Ishmael and Queequeg are explicitly compared to husband and wife sharing a bed as a, quote, cozy loving pair. I'm not here to say it's an unambiguously good trope by any means. The non-white character is rarely fully developed, and generally serves as much as a prop or narrative convenience for the white male protagonist as he does any kind of genuine friend and companion. These are stories of white superiority and colonization, if not straight-up white supremacy. And that ain't good. But these shitty ideals and the damage and genocide that they have motivated are an integral part of America and American culture, and these stories are core to the American mythos for better or worse. Well, probably for worse. Star Trek, too, is part of these traditions, even if maybe not quite so blindly and enthusiastically as its forebears. Starfleet can definitely take on an edge of colonialism as it explores space, the final frontier, and colonial traditions and tendencies need to be acknowledged and scrutinized in the stories Star Trek tells. But at the same time, this is not that essay, though I will do my best not to ignore those problems. The part of these trends that I intend to focus on here is that archetype of white man and other utterly devoted to one another in the exploration of the unknown. An inhabited unknown, but arguably an unknown nonetheless. An interesting way that the Kirk and Spock dynamic stands out in this tradition is that Vulcans, the sort of quote-unquote native other to this realm of space, are considered to be universally better than humans, stronger, smarter, and more civilized. The power imbalances or objectification of members of other cultures that are inherent to earlier versions of this archetype are dramatically weakened, if not dismantled outright, by this difference. In fact, I would argue that the power imbalances between Kirk and Spock are minimal. Though Kirk is, of course, captain, and as such is Spock's superior officer, we have every indication that Spock is physically stronger, and not all that concerned about mutiny given the right situation. Overall, whether you consider it a bromance or a romance, Kirk and Spock hold an important place in the American mythos, and given the power and popularity of the Kirk/Spock or Spirk ship, and its place in the formation of modern fandom culture, I would consider the homoeroticism a relevant part of that dynamic. From acts of self-sacrifice to Edith Keeler's description of Spock, who belongs at Kirk's side as if he's always been there and always will be, it's not hard to argue that these two are an inseparable duo. And I do want to acknowledge that this relationship doesn't have to be romantic. People can have close friends, and not all intimacy need be romantic by any means. After all, so far as explicit verifiable canon is concerned, the relationship between the two is entirely platonic. That being said, given how rare canon queer relationships were in media for such a long time, it can be really nice to recognize oneself, or relationships like your own, in your favorite characters in media. Reading queer subtext is fun, and it doesn't actually prevent anyone else from preferring other interpretations. When I refer to Kirk and Spock's gayness, what I am most explicitly referring to is their intimacy and closeness. That doesn't have to be read romantically, you can read that any way you please, but I know for myself, and for many others, it's fun to consider it gay. So now I'm going to tell you about how Kirk and Spock are essentially married, and break down how 2 movies prove it. I would argue that the homoeroticism in Star Trek the Motion Picture is pretty blatant. But if you'll bear with me for a minute, I'm going to talk about the straights. I know that's not why you're here, but it'll matter in a minute, I promise. See, in the motion picture, there are 2 new central characters added to the cast alongside the original bridge crew. The first is Decker, a strapping young man who was going to captain the Enterprise until Admiral Kirk, his mentor, takes control instead. The other is Ilea, an alien woman who has a history with Decker and who, later in the film, is turned into a drone for the encroaching alien entity V'ger. Real quick, the premise of the motion picture is that there's this big mysterious entity that nobody can talk to, just heading through space, destroying everything in its path, making a beeline for Earth. For some reason, the Enterprise is the best for the job, so they send it out, and they meet V'ger head-on. Turns out it's this conscious machine that's eating everything to record it, and it hates carbon units, or life forms more generally, humans, thinks they're an infestation. Anyway, back to the straights. Based on Decker and Ilea's history together, there is a continual tension between the two. Decker was stationed on Ilea's home planet, Delta 4, and they were apparently close, but Decker had to leave and didn't say goodbye. Bit of a dick move, Decker, I can't lie. Like, I get it, but still. When Ilea shows up on the Enterprise, Decker is glad to see her, and the two are generally personable, though they have a confrontation later that establishes loosely the terms they separated on. Once Ilea is taken by V'ger and returned as the entity's drone, our heroes recognize that this replicated mechanical Ilea still has the original Ilea's memories of and feelings about Decker, even if they are generally overridden by V'ger's analytical priorities. This gives our heroes a potential point of connection with V'ger to better communicate and maybe convince it to stop hating humans. When eventually the crew recognizes that V'ger is searching for meaning that its mechanical mind can't comprehend, it is Decker who joins with V'ger, and as such, Ilea, allowing them both to reach beyond life and experience as we know it. These 2 characters work as the film's romantic leads, and scholar Harvey R. Greenberg notes that, quote, "The film's conclusion implies that V'ger has discovered the meaning it sought through the infusion of human love. Such materialist/humanist texts commonly assert that heterosexual union is as much an intimation of the divine as any being can reasonably expect." Decker and Ilea are pretty universally read as lovers without hesitation. But this is never stated explicitly in the film, not even remotely. There are no I love yous exchanged, only one singular ambiguous mention of a, quote, relationship between them, which is directly preceded by a comment about what feelings the Ilea V'ger drone might have. This comment mentions friendship explicitly, but not romantic love. Ilea also makes a throwaway comment about a vow of celibacy that might complicate an especially traditional, straight, allosexual reading of these characters. And I don't mean to complain that these characters are presented this way. A more nebulous concept of love, affection, closeness, whatever you want to call it, is really cool. But we'll come back to that nuance in a little bit. First, you have spent so much time watching this video, and I have yet to talk about how the motion picture is possibly the gayest Star Trek film. So let's get into that. The best place to start is probably to break down Kirk and Spock's mutual character arc. The motion picture starts with Spock on Vulcan seeking enlightenment through Kolinar, a ritual to purge all emotion, and Kirk still serving Starfleet, having been promoted to Admiral. It actually takes a while, over 45 minutes into the movie, for Spock to arrive on the Enterprise. He is hoping to connect with V'ger, this new and strange entity, and the Enterprise is headed that way, so here he is, back on the bridge, even more cold and logical than ever before. But Kirk is glad to see Spock again, and the two are generally personable, though they have a confrontation later that establishes loosely the terms they separated on. Information is exchanged, but we are no closer to the usual status quo of Kirk and Spock inseparable space duo. Spock is still closed off. It is after Spock connects with V'ger and finds a purely logical mind that is searching desperately for something more that he returns his trust to Kirk. He finds that his answers and V'ger's answers lie with emotion, imagination, and humanity. For Spock, this humanity is exemplified in Kirk, and indeed, he ends the film back at Kirk's side, where he always has been and always will be.
Does this sound familiar to you at all? I put it to you that Kirk and Spock and Decker and Ilia follow essentially the same character arcs.
Kirk and Decker are regularly compared to and associated with one another, with Kirk having been Decker's mentor, and many accusations are thrown around that the two of them, but mostly Kirk, are competing for control of the Enterprise. So we have these two versions of the same man, leading the Enterprise and serving on the command track, who are unexpectedly faced with the return of an alien they have a complicated history with. Spock and Ilia, then, are both changed by contact with V'ger, though in very different ways, and both Spock and the V'ger-Ilia hybrid are searching for answers and enlightenment where logic has failed them. That search for enlightenment then leads them to connect with humanity and emotion via Kirk and Decker, respectively.
Going back to Greenberg's analysis of the motion picture's climax, he says,
"Such materialist/humanist texts commonly assert that heterosexual union is as much an intimation of the divine as any being can reasonably expect." But he then concludes that though Spock was searching for similar answers to V'ger, quote, "Spock must settle for the sublimations of male friendship."
I personally find this absurd.
Given these similarities, I have to insist that if we are to consider one relationship romantic, the other can't be regarded as purely, undeniably, traditionally platonic. The textual, canonical ambiguity is fine, by the way. I honestly quite enjoy it. But if we, as an audience, are meant to believe, or choose to believe, that only Decker and Ilia's relationship is romantically charged, we are ignoring a character dynamic of equal or greater intimacy right under our noses.
That being said, this is not the only form of homoerotic subtext present in the original Star Trek films. Where a homoerotic reading of the motion picture is encouraged by apparent parallels with the straight romance in the film, the search for Spock is the pinnacle of what I would call traditional bromance in the original series.
What I mean by traditional bromance is the inherent homoeroticism of dedication and loyalty, most often seen in the aforementioned trend of being so very misogynist that a story overshoots into gay, which also regularly intermingles with the intimacy allowed between men in the drama and sacrifice of war. That is to say, the long-standing tradition of putting bros so far before hoes that, though it doesn't have to be gay, it is a stronger relationship than anything these guys are shown to have with women. Search for Spock is where Kirk's devotion to Spock really shines.
The word, sir?
The word is no. I am therefore going anyway.
Spock is more easily read as queer, I made a whole video about it, and in a pinch is a bit more recognizably devoted between the two in the text. Between his comparative lack of romantic interests and his grand acts of self-sacrifice. Kirk's sacrifices are more often overshadowed by crises. For instance, Kirk's commitment to saving Spock's life in a mock time at the risk of his career is compelling, but it is very easy to get distracted by the everything about Ponfar.
The homoerotic subtext around Kirk is also more heavily muddled by his many love interests and his cultural reputation for having a woman at every starbase. But, alas, all those women must be left behind. If nothing else, Kirk is married to the Enterprise. No woman could compare. In Search for Spock, there is no romantic subplot for Kirk, and he stands uncharacteristically alone in the place of protagonist without Spock to keep him company. This is a story about Kirk and his quest to get his husband back. I mean his boyfriend. I mean best friend. I mean first officer. I mean husband. And frankly, we're off to a running start for homoerotic subtext in this film, with Kirk lamenting almost immediately,
The death of Spock is like an open wound. It seems that I have left the noblest part of myself back there on that newborn planet.
Not only does this dialogue cement the importance of Spock to Kirk, it also invokes the old idiom of my better half, most often used to refer to a romantic partner. And it's reminiscent of dialogue from The Wrath of Khan about Kirk's old love, Dr. Carol Marcus. Talking to Bones in the prior film, he speaks of reconnecting with Dr. Marcus as, quote, opening old wounds. And speaking of Leonard Bones McCoy, Kirk is further isolated in this film by McCoy's compromised state. Along with losing Spock, Kirk is losing all the things most important to him, as the Enterprise itself is even being retired. The man supposedly married to his ship will soon have no ship, and he doesn't have his two closest friends either. This emotional turmoil and the resulting arc are probably the best thing about this movie. With a comparatively weak plot made to get us from not having Spock to having Spock again as dramatically and efficiently as possible, it is Kirk's struggles that really ground the film and engage the audience. Everything on the Genesis planet is fine, but it's a bunch of characters that we only sort of know running around a rapidly deteriorating world. Kirk, on the other hand, we've been following this whole time. He's who we really care about, and he cares desperately about Spock. Further supporting the married couple vibes between Kirk and Spock, Sarek comes to Kirk to find Spock's Katra. A Katra is explained to us as being a sort of soul. As a final dying gesture, Vulcans pass this soul on to someone to lay it to rest, somehow, back on Vulcan. But Kirk does not have the Katra, much to his dismay and Sarek's confusion. Kirk is very clear here about his love for Spock, explaining that
Your son meant more to me than you can know.
But he and Spock were separated at the time of Spock's death. There could be no mind meld to pass on the Katra. Instead, it's McCoy that holds the Katra, and it's driving him crazy. So, for the benefit of both Spock and McCoy, we've got to go back to Genesis, a planet now extremely off-limits. Time to steal a starship. In stealing back the Enterprise, his beloved ship, Kirk stares his Starfleet superiors in the face and turns against orders. Even the threat of never sitting in the captain's chair again doesn't faze him. James T. Kirk will go to Genesis, and no one's gonna stop him. Especially with his crack team of specialists at his side. But turning his back on Starfleet Command is only the beginning of the sacrifices Kirk makes in this film. Even heavier losses are waiting for him on Genesis. Lieutenant Saavik and David, Kirk's son, are stranded on Genesis once Klingons destroy the ship they were serving on. By the time the Enterprise arrives, Saavik, David, and the rapidly aging, mindless, for lack of a better word, body of Spock have all been taken prisoner by the Klingons, and the Klingon commander levels a threat at Kirk practically as soon as they come into contact with one another. The commander wants the secret of Genesis, and he will kill prisoners until Kirk hands it over. In fact, he will kill one immediately to prove it. This is how David dies, taking the brunt of this Klingon threat. In the search for Spock, Kirk loses his son, his family. With David's death, we are also returned to Trek's eternal status quo. Like the cowboys and frontiersmen that inspired the character of Kirk, the core trio of Star Trek, and in fact the whole bridge crew, cannot be tied down by traditional romances or families. Their only commitment is to the ship, and the episodic status quo dictates that they will forever remain untethered, exploring the stars together. Bones gets closest to acknowledging this status quo in Star Trek V, muttering about how other people have families. Kirk must sacrifice his chance at a traditional family to regain Spock.
But that serves the status quo that has always existed in Star Trek. After all, Dr. Carol Marcus, David's mother, disappears after the Wrath of Khan with no fanfare and is never seen again. It means a little bit more to disrupt the status quo.
To even the odds against the Klingon crew terrorizing them, Kirk and his crew make a nearly unthinkable sacrifice. They set the Enterprise, whose voyages we have followed so loyally, to self-destruct. From the planet's surface, Kirk and the audience watch the starship burn, filled with melancholy, if not horror. "My God, Bones," Kirk says. "What have I done?" McCoy's response gets at the theme of the film.
What you had to do. What you always do. Turn death into a fighting chance to live.
This was a necessary sacrifice, the film says. Kirk destroyed the Enterprise, the ship to whom he was so deeply linked that he could make no other commitments, for the chance to revive Spock. The film further confirms that this was the right thing to do by bringing in the Star Trek theme music, if only for a moment, when Kirk steps onto the bridge with Spock under his arm.
Bones, help Spock. We've got to break out of orbit.
The Enterprise may be a tragic loss, but it was not about the ship. It was never about the ship. Kirk has always been dedicated to his crew, and, maybe most of all, to Spock. Once they reach Vulcan, the apparently risky and complex ritual of Faltor Pan is undertaken to reunite Spock's mind, which has been sharing headspace with McCoy, with Spock's body. As the very extended ritual wraps up, we first confirm that McCoy made it out okay. Kirk also then briefly speaks with Sarek, bookending his mission. Once again, Kirk affirms how important this was, saying, "If I hadn't tried, the cost would have been my soul." But finally, our heroes are reunited. Kirk no longer stands alone. He has recovered the noblest part of himself. The needs of the one, he admits, outweigh the needs of the many. That one, of course, is Spock, whose revival was worth such great risks and loss, but the one may also be Kirk, who so desperately needs Spock that he would take this mission on without hesitation or true regret. And then, the final payoff, the line that was reportedly written first, with the rest of the script written backwards from there. Spock turns to Kirk and confirms to him and the audience that he is, in most ways that matter, himself.
Jim. Your name is Jim.
And as dialogue fades out and Spock raises his eyebrow in a familiar expression, the Star Trek theme swells to let us know that all is once again right in this world. No sacrifice was in vain if it returned Spock to the story and to Kirk.
The extreme lengths that Kirk goes to in this film, all geared towards taking a chance on the possibility of saving Spock's life, present a picture of a man so dedicated to another that love really is the best word to describe it. Consider it platonic or romantic, the intimacy and devotion between these two is unparalleled. The status quo of the original series is, among other things, homoerotic, and that makes for some real gay movies.
TOS is also part of a long homoerotic tradition in American myth, which is only further solidified by the parallel romantic narratives in the motion picture, and the ultimate dedication shown by Kirk in Search for Spock. Though the homoerotic subtext comes through in different ways movie to movie, Both films hinge on the intimate and dedicated relationship between Kirk and Spock, taking things even another step, or several, further than the multitude of more casual, if still deeply intimate, interactions between the two that were spread out across the series itself.
So, there you have it. That's how these are the two gayest Star Trek films. Sure, canonically, textually, explicitly speaking, Kirk and Spock are just friends, and that is perfectly lovely in its own right. But given that we are only just now getting substantial LGBTQ plus rep in media, including Star Trek, and I'm married to my best friend, I'm gonna call these two gay married. Thanks for coming to my Space Husband's TED Talk. Live long and prosper.
Thanks so much for watching. This video was made by popular demand from viewers like you, so let me know in the comments what else you might want to see a video on. Do you prefer one of these movies over the other, or have another favorite Star Trek movie? Or do you have a Spurk hot take? I'd love to hear from you. I'd also really appreciate it if you would give this video a thumbs up if you liked it, and maybe even consider subscribing and checking out some of the other videos on this channel. Any and all interaction really helps, and you can also follow Video Eclectic on social media to stay in the loop on new videos, and if you're feeling especially generous, you can support the channel on Patreon or Ko-fi. Thanks again for tuning in, and have a good one.